So we continue explaining the different theories that provide more insight as to when we will help others and why we help others. Latney and Darley's research regarding bystander intervention and including the bystander effect focus more on cases of an emergency, focuses more on these cases where it's more of a matter of life or death, and putting ourselves at risk of losing our lives, or putting ourselves in a situation in which loss is pretty much, the cost of loss is pretty much high. There are other theories that explain also, provide insight and different explanations as to why and when we will help others, or when and why we engage in pro-social behavior. But these theories, and it's important to clarify this, as it will help you, perhaps on the exams, that these theories from now on provide insight into a more broad sense of pro-social behavior, meaning not only limited to emergency cases where there's perhaps most likely a matter of life or death. The first one is social learning theory, very similar. We explain this with aggressive behavior. So we learn the bad and we learn the good too. Remember that learning in psychology, I can't emphasize this enough, is basically acquiring behavior. When we continue to engage in a particular behavior, or we continue to exhibit a particular behavior, that means that behavior has been learned. And the same way we learn behaviors, the same way we can unlearn them. But we'll see that in the learning unit. The important thing here is I have to make a reference back to the very beginning of the module, in which we learn the reciprocity norm. This is a social norm that is very compelling. I provided the explanation or the example as to when we are kids and we feel that we should invite those that invited us to a particular party or an event. And this continues on throughout life. We feel a really strong sense of returning that favor, returning that benefit, that pro-social behavior. The social responsibility norm is a different norm, and says that we should help others in need. We should help others that do not have the resources necessary to reciprocate. Still, we see as morally valuable, yes, to ourselves, that it is necessary to help others. This is seen more likely in, there seems to be a more clear and more urgent social responsibility norm, or it's more enforced, or people feel the need to conform to the social responsibility norm in religious communities. Your textbook talks about how it is, I think, don't quote me on this, double check, but your textbook mentions, I think that research indicates religious people or people that attend religious service at least once a week report helping others in need, or are twice more likely to help others in need. Double check that, but it's important here to highlight this relationship between religion or religiosity and the social responsibility norm. To sum this all up, social learning theory tells us that if the socialization agents around us have exhibited continuously this behavior of helping others in need, usually helping others that help us or helping others that cannot return that favor, that we encode that behavior, we see it's good because it's rewarded, and we will engage in that behavior as well. And this is based all on the principle of Albert Bandura's, don't forget to include this, should you have to explain pro-social behavior based on social learning theory, this is all based on Albert Bandura's concept of observational learning. Remember, this was a study with the Bobo doll experiment. Social exchange theory is another alternative to explaining pro-social behavior, and we'll also talk about this in terms of attraction, personal attraction, what draws us to other people. And it's pretty simple. It's a very much economics-based theory. It explains basically that all our social behavior is simply a trade-off, that it's a give and take. More specifically, that everything that is social, right, any behavior that is social that involves other people, specifically in this case to help others, we will do as long as, and listen clearly, as long as that behavior will lead us to maximize the benefits and reduce the costs. What every business, it's the same goal any business would have. And so for, just to give you an example, and I'm pretty sure this example is the same one from your textbook, but let's say somebody wants to donate blood. You're thinking about it. I'm terribly panicked with needles, so I can't even thinking about it. I don't know why I put this example, because now I'm just freaking out, but okay. So breathe, Mr. Sarkos. Okay, let's continue on. So if I decide to donate blood, right, should I donate blood? Not a good example for this, but anyway, most of you out there that are great sports, you might relate to this better than I do. So what are the costs of donating blood? Well, there's this discomfort, right? That's a cost. That's something negative. There's anxiety. There's time. Perhaps you won't make your AP psychology class because you're going to feel all lightheaded. So these are the costs of engaging in that behavior of donating blood. Now, what are the benefits of it? Well, you can reduce guilt for not, the guilt of not helping others. Looking good in terms of social approval. And so those would be the benefits of this, right? And so then basically social exchange theory tells us that we will help others. We will engage in pro-social behavior as long as the discomfort, the anxiety, and the time, in this case, for donating blood, are not greater than our need to look good in front of others, our need to reduce guilt, or our need to boost self-esteem based on the self-perception of being a nice and community builder, team player that helps others in need. So again, in my case, well, actually it's not that bad of an example. In my case, I really am phobic with needles. I can't, even the word. But because I have that anxiety is so great to the point that it's almost a phobia. It is just the cost is way, way, way too great for me, and therefore they outweigh the benefits. So again, if the reward exceeds the cost, which is not my case, fortunately for many of you out there, it would be, we will help. Another proposal that explains why we help others is the empathy-altruism hypothesis, developed by Dan Batson in 1991. I forget what university he is. Yeah, I forget completely, but completely blanking out on that. But the important thing here is to understand what the empathy-altruism hypothesis is, which basically centers on the key to this theory is empathy as a driver to altruistic behavior. In other words, empathy will drive us to exhibit altruistic behavior. Now, when we talk about empathy, what we mean is, you've heard it plenty of times, it's to put ourselves in the shoes of another person, and this is the key, guys, to experience what that other person feels from their point of view. It's not just saying, oh, wow, that's sad that happened to you. I can understand that you're sad. It's basically feeling the same sadness as that other person does. Again, experiencing what they experience. So then Batson's theory, empathy-altruism hypothesis, it claims that feeling empathy produces altruism. Knowing that someone is feeling distress, if we are empathic, then we will feel also distressed. And then, therefore, that will, or at least almost as much distress as the other person does. And this will drive us to exhibit altruistic behavior. That'll be our only motivator, to help others. Now, it's important to understand that empathy-altruism hypothesis does not contradict social exchange theory. This is very important. It's not it doesn't oppose social exchange theory. In fact, it does recognize it. And the reason why I'm also highlighting this is because what I'm going to introduce in a minute, an experiment, the study, the classic study for this empathy-altruism hypothesis, includes social exchange theory claims. But what the empathy-altruism hypothesis by Batson proposes is that empathy can override this sort of give and take view or process before helping others. Before we go into that, there's another model. You should just know the name of it. It's the negative state relief model. And this does oppose, in a way, empathy-altruism hypothesis. It criticizes Batson's theory because it basically claims that true altruism is not true. It does not exist. That when we help others, whether you are Mother Teresa or anybody else, or Gandhi, or any of these, bigger-than-life leaders that are known for their empathy, for giving it all just for a cause of helping others, negative state relief model says yes. There is, it's not that we don't recognize that these are glorious acts. However, there's a part of us that does these type of things because we just cannot live with the guilt after this. So it's just we do it in a way to reduce this. If we feel empathy, that means we are feeling also distress. Therefore, there is something in it for us. And that is the reduction of this guilt or this negative feeling that because we feel empathy for the other person, oh no, it's not about them only, it's also about us, because if we are empathic, we are feeling the negative state that the other person in distress is feeling too. Whereas Batson claims that true altruism does exist, and that this is in no way, that this has nothing to do with us sort of feeling, Batson's view is not as, let's say, that feeling empathy does not just makes us in this person of like, oh no, I'm feeling bad too, and therefore I need to reduce my bad feelings, that we sort of put that on the side and help others because we are feeling the plight of others in need of help. A classic study carried out by Toy and Batson in 1982, called also the note-sharing study or the Carroll study. I learned it as a Carroll study. But this is a study that evaluated this altruism versus self-interest. What is it in for me, or pure altruism? Contrasted both in a very clever design that I'll explain in a minute. And it's called the note-sharing Carroll study. So pay close attention. If you need to draw as I explain, please do so. It helps me a lot. In this study, all the participants, all subjects, had to hear a recording by another presumed college student. Her name is Carol. And Carol also takes intro to psych with these participants. So they would hear a recording from Carol, and in this recording, participants would find out that Carol was actually in a car accident and needs some notes from the class. Now, it's worth mentioning, again, reiterating that Carol takes intro to psych, perhaps a different section. They don't know yet what the situation is. They know she's an intro to psych student. Now, the dependent variable here, we'll begin by that. What is being measured here is whether participants would be willing to share their notes. That was whether or not participants would be willing to share their notes. That would be the operational definition of prosocial behavior. Now, what Toy and Batson did very cleverly was to manipulate two variables. So we're going to have four different conditions here. Independent variable 1 was empathy. So in independent variable 2 was cost of helping. or cost of not helping in this case. Let's begin with independent variable 1, and this is the empathy condition. So, one group would be induced to feel empathy, meaning they would ask subjects to try to imagine what it feels like to be in Carol's situation. Subjects in the non-empathy or low empathy condition would be asked to say, be objective about this. The other variable, independent variable 2, remember they were manipulating cost. And in the high cost condition, they would tell subjects that they would see Carol 10 days after the study, or perhaps in every class after the study. And then in the second condition, subjects were told that they were never going to see Carol. So, as you can see, in regards to the second independent variable 2, in the former condition, the one in which you're going to see Carol more often, cost is high, because you're going to see this person every day, and you're going to be you're going to be paying an emotional toll. Oh my God, I really have to see you. You are a reminder that I did not help you. How horrible person that is. Emotional toll is pretty high. If you do not consider that high cost, then I think we need to talk. But it is uncomfortable, right? So high cost versus a low cost, you're off the hook completely. Well, I didn't help you, period. I'm done with the study. I got the credit necessary, and there's no personal incentive. There is no benefit here, so I don't lose anything should I not help you. So think about this. Combine each of there are 4 different conditions here. You have a high empathy condition, and within the high empathy condition, you have the manipulation of independent variable 2. So you have people that were induced to feel empathy, but the cost was low. Feel like Carol try to imagine what Carol is feeling, and you'll never see her again. Then you have subjects in the high empathy condition 2, but that we're told that cost was high, meaning you're going to feel like Carol is feeling, try to imagine that, but remember, you're also going to see Carol every day. So high empathy, cost is high too. Those are 2 conditions, and now in the low empathy condition, you also have 2 groups. You have low empathy condition, just be objective about this, and then cost is high, be objective about this, and remember that you're going to see Carol every day after this study. Or be objective about this, cost is low, personal benefit is low, and meaning you're not going to see her ever again. So the results, you can find them there, and it is, as you can see, with the low empathy condition, right, no empathy, altruistic behavior, meaning there was a difference in when empathy was not induced, the people did engage in this social exchange theory approach as to what is in it for me. But as you can see in the high empathy condition, when empathy was induced, the difference is minimal. People thought very minimally about what is in it for them. So the conclusion here is that regardless of whether the participants would see Carol or not, they didn't care whether the cost was high or low. As long as you were led to feel empathy for the other person, they would still feel compelled to engage in altruistic behavior. And basically, high empathy leads to altruistic behavior. It doesn't matter whether the cost is high or low. And this is, again, a very clever study that Batson and Toy used, I can imagine, as a way to say, hey, listen, empathy, altruism does exist. We don't care about what is in it for us if there is true empathy. So again, I want to just summarize that Batson's study does demonstrate the powers of feeling empathy that that empathy has the power to overcome other more self-interest or egoistic motivations, as they call it, and that would lead us to help others under other circumstances. Okay, so the last subtopic for the unit, we're almost there, guys. It has to do with conflict and peace. In different ways, we have already addressed the different types of conflicts, but conflict in general it's actually a very common term in psychology, and it refers to anytime you have an opposing or incompatible action with another party. Incompatible actions, objectives, ideas, you have a conflict. And usually, as I said, conflict can be between two parties, between two people, countries, groups, or we also have internal conflicts, like within us, when cognitive dissonance we feel cognitive dissonance when there is a conflict between our attitudes and our behavior, or between our attitudes. And conflicts are the opposite of peace, and therefore we must address these conflicts in order to have peace, or to reach productivity or harmony, which are contributors to our well-being. So in this last part of this module, we're going to address or brush really quickly through the different elements of a conflict. Why is it? What is at play during conflicts or in conflicts, and how to solve them? What does social psychology propose that are practical ways on addressing different types of conflicts? So we already defined conflict. You also have this in your textbook. But again, I want to highlight its key words here is incompatibility of anything, basically, of goals, of actions, ideas. We're going to have a conflict. Lately, our country, right, the U.S. has been going through much conflict, political turmoil because of this, because of the different events in the last months. The important thing here is to understand the underlying processes that psychology describes as being important mechanisms in a conflict, and these are social traps and distorted perceptions. So let's begin with social traps. Social traps lead to conflicts because there is a short-term goal, let's say, or solution, and there's a long-term goal or a long-term solution to a problem. Now, sometimes the short-term solution is more, let's say, indulgent. We are the ones as individuals who benefit from it, and from a particular situation. And the long-term goal, perhaps, the group is the more benefited one, but not necessarily. A social trap can be also individual, and I'll give you an example of this. So. This is an example that was used in my social psychology class when I studied this in grad school. So I apologize if it's not the most appropriate one. But let's just say that many people are enticed into drinking too much, right, at a party, over 21. And a lot of people, many people over 21 are enticed to drinking perhaps a lot in a party. Now, the short-term pleasure, or the short-term goal is addressed because, you feel pleasure. Pleasure is immediate, right? It's individual. But their discomfort is perhaps in the long term, and it's going to be much worse. So if you weigh the long-term discomfort, the hangover basically comes later. In what people who might be going through a terrible hangover after drinking too much at a party always say, I'll never drink again in my life. And now, not that necessarily is true, but that does indicate that what they're feeling at the moment makes them say, the paraphrase there is, it wasn't worth it. I am feeling so bad right now, I shouldn't have done it. Meaning, what I'm feeling right now outweighs, the displeasure outweighs the pleasure that I was feeling last night when I was in the party and having fun and drinking too much. So, so people that are on, let's say, on a particular diet, that they need to keep a particular diet for health reasons, might also feel in a social trap within themselves. Like I don't want to gratify myself immediately, and that's very difficult, but I know that in the long run, it'll be much better for me than the immediate. So these are social traps. Now, social traps could also be seen from a collective point of view, like you know, like, let's say a collective social trap could be a situation in which we don't act against the group interest necessarily, but because we want to benefit as individuals, once all of us do the same thing, because all of us are going to look for what's in it for us, then we will be affecting the group interest. So there's no intention, perhaps, of hurting or harming the group, but our self-interest as a collective is going to actually hurt us all in the end. I'll give you an example. Perhaps, let's say, people normally leave work at 5, right? So, you know, if you leave at 5, you're going to be earlier at home than if you leave at 6. But then everybody thinks that way. So what ends up happening? Everyone leaves their work at 5, and then we have congestion, lots of traffic, and perhaps you're going to be at home not that much earlier, and the consequences are that we all lost. So a situation in which some of us think, instead of thinking about ourselves, or about us getting early to work, if we thought about the collective, perhaps we would say, okay, well then I'll leave at 6, you know. But it's very difficult, again, because it's very difficult to see the long-term or the big picture rewards. And that's what basically a social trap is. Global warming is another example. When we, if I throw plastic into a lake, perhaps that, you know, well, that doesn't give me personal interest, so that's not a good example. But if I, let's say, if I am there was this case, I think, about crab fishermen in Alaska. So at first, I think, yeah, it was crab. So at first, crabs were plentiful and fishermen were few, right? So each of them benefited from this without making any, you know, they would sell their stuff, they would sell their crabs, their fish, and they would make it, all of them would make actually large profitable catches, right? Then, so to raise profits, each added boats to their fleets, and their businesses went booming. And then for a while, this did increase their individual profits. However, what happened was that this booming led to overfishing. And as fishing fleets grew and the catch per boat decreased, then with fewer crabs, the reproduction rate of crabs slowed. And crab fishermen actually went bankrupt, I believe they did. And so individually, their actions made sense, but collectively, they suffered greatly. In the long run, they suffered greatly. That's what basically is a social trap, a collective social trap, which is, I think, the ones that they focus on in this chapter. And culture loss, we have a lot to say about how Native Americans, their culture has been lost in terms of occupying certain territory. I mean, right now that's pretty much an in vogue topic with this pipeline, and how how now they're fighting back. But normally what happens is that these big corporations, for their own profit, they are, in the long run, you know, we're losing a culture. And that is more important than anything, right? At the risk of sounding a little cheesy. And to illustrate social traps, or to illustrate these situations, there's this game called the Prisoner's Dilemma game. It's in your book, it's explained as a non-zero sum game. And I have to confess that I always have to review the Prisoner's Dilemma game. So what I'll do is I'll put in a video that you and I would both review collectively, and we can talk about it in class. But it's basically to illustrate how if we're in it for ourselves, if we approach situations, social situations, being in it for ourselves only, then we are the ones who will, perhaps all of us will lose. But if we are willing to make basically some compromise, then we could perhaps not lose as much or earn somewhat. So that'll be better explained with the prisoner's dilemmas game. Other underlying mechanisms, psychological underlying mechanisms that contribute to the escalation of conflict are mirror image perceptions. These are, again, dynamics that sort of make us lock into a conflict and not allow us to solve or to reach peace. And it's very simple. A mirror image perception is basically when, it's basically in every single conflict, if you have observed. And I know it's very difficult sometimes to see that it's not that way, trust me, especially with politics. But it is true that we view ourselves generally as being the ones we are, the ethical, peaceful ones, and the other ones are the untrustworthy, the ones with evil intentions, the bad guys. We are the good, they are the bad, this very binary view of a conflict. And I know it's very difficult to see, but by having these mirror image perceptions, by seeing ourselves as the good and the other as the bad, of course, this breeds stereotyping, of course, the in-out group biases, and then again, this is only going to lead to more conflict. So this is, again, the term here to remember is a mirror image perception as the dynamics that underlie in conflict that make it worse. And why do we need to learn this? Well, because in order to solve conflict, we need to look at how these elements are playing into a particular conflict, whether it be between individuals or countries or you name it. Okay, one of my favorite concepts in psychology in general is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It took me a while to digest, to understand it. Well, not to understand it, to believe in it, I'd say. But there is plenty of scientific evidence for it. So let's begin by defining it. And self-fulfilling prophecies are a psychological process through which it's a psychological process through which someone's expectations about a situation or another person will lead to the fulfillment of those expectations. So again, it's very important to clear here that my expectation of another person will shape that other person's behavior. That's the direction of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Or I expect a situation to be in a particular way, and that situation will be close to or will be exactly as I expected it to be. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. Self-fulfilling prophecy is the fact that other people's expectations can or will shape, most likely, the behavior or the situation that is the target of that expectation. So again, I repeat, the expectation becomes sort of a cause. So that what is expected comes true because it was expected. I don't know, that sounds kind of weird, but yeah. So now, very important, have your notes ready. So self-fulfilling prophecy, remember that in the last multiple choice quiz, a lot of people were having some trouble because you need to identify what are the steps or what are the requirements for a particular psychological phenomena. So in the self-fulfilling prophecy, first of all, a perceiver, right, let's say ourselves, we form an expectation about a situation or a target person. That's the first thing that needs to happen in self-fulfilling prophecy. Second step, my perceptions or the perceiver's expectations affect how he or she behaves in the situation or treats the target person. So my expectations are going to affect how I behave, right? I behave in a particular situation, or my expectations of a person are going to lead to me treating a person in a particular way. Then third, the situation or the target person is affected by my expectations in a way that confirms my initial expectation. maybe by the research. Let me look up here. Yeah, it was Rosenthal and Jacobson in the late 60s. Their study is fascinating. What they did was they did this. It's fascinating too. They did this study. They made classroom teachers believe that some of their students were going to be potential bloomers. Potential bloomers were basically somebody, a kid that was going to show this sort of peak all of a sudden of IQ during the school year. I think they were third graders. And basically, so they said that this test was going to predict who were going to be those intellectual bloomers, potential bloomers, right, of the school year. The test was completely bogus. And what they did was they randomly selected half of the students or a number of students, and they told the teachers, oh, this test actually predicted that these 10, 15 kids, let's just say, are going to show a spark or I don't know, a peak of IQ in throughout the year, sometime this year. Now, again, remember, the test was completely bogus. It did not measure anything. And then what do you think happened? Well, the teachers actually expected these kids, these students who were identified to them, and because only of their expectations, what ended up happening? At the end of the school year, these students actually, then they were measured by their IQ, and they were in grades, I think, too, and they actually did show a substantial increase in their intellectual ability and in their scholarship ability as well. So, and again, these were selected just randomly. But apparently what happened is, and again, it's a fascinating study, it has many details, but apparently the teachers, because the expectation was high, they sort of stepped up to the plate. And this reminds me a lot, for teachers, it's essential for this to know. And so this is basically saying that if I have a student that I don't expect much from him or her, then this is going to sort of affect the behavior of that student. And you can see this happening because it's not, don't see the expectation as something sort of there in my mind that's right there looming over us without us knowing. No, my expectations are going to affect my behavior, the second step, and then my behavior is going to confirm to the other person or going to send a message that is going to affect the target of my perception. And we're going to sort of, that person is going to confirm that initial perception to me. So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, also called the Pygmalion effect because of a Greek legend or something like that. I don't think it's relevant now, but just in case, it is important to know that it's also named by that. So again, you can see there in the chart, our actions are going to impact how other people see us, right? We see here, our actions are going to impact how other people see us, right? And the way they see us is going to lead to ways they're going to behave, right? The actions of others, how they behave towards us. And then that's what's going to reinforce our belief about ourselves and about them as well. And then that's going to, our beliefs about ourselves and about them, also I would add to that chart, is going to influence our actions. So remember, this has a lot to do with attitudes. And I think that what I would dare to say that they're sort of intertwined here. So again, our attitude towards somebody is going to perhaps lead our behavior towards that person. And then again, it's just a sort of a vicious cycle that we need to be much aware of. And in conflict, this has much to do. If I expect the other one to be immoral, to be evil, to be ill-intended, then anything that person does, I'm pretty much going to categorize it under this is what evil people do. And it does distort perceptions. It reminds me of the previous dynamic that we talked about the mirror image perceptions. Almost there, guys. So what can we do to solve conflict? The 4 C's, contact, cooperation, communication, and conciliation. Let's jump to them. Please note before, though, that all of these can be applied to prejudice and discrimination as a type of conflict. Please remember that, because I've seen it in other textbooks that some things we're going to talk about here, they place them in the discrimination prejudice portion of the textbook. So first proposal, and the easiest one, the simple one, is to put the two conflicting parties in contact with each other. Now, this instruction comes with some very specific, instructions as well, which is that this contact cannot be competitive. Putting people to compete against each other is not a way to put them in contact. Also, parties need to be in equal status, meaning they need to feel that they're equally powerful in whatever group they're working for, studying in. And this is also important to know, because at a social level, at a society level, your textbook explains how in South Africa, by integrating Black Africans and white Africans or Europeans, the simple contact just did not work, because those minorities from lower status did not improve the way they view white Europeans or white Africans from a higher status group. So simple contact needs to include those two things. Remember that. It needs to be a non-competitive environment and an equal status. It has proven that contact is supported by research that indicates, especially lately, that heterosexuals, both men and women, have become more supportive of same-sex marriage, because most of these who become supportive of same-sex marriage say that the reason why they support same-sex marriage is basically because of their contact with somebody who is close to them, who they know is gay, and that was the main reason for their attitude change. So again, here we see a friendship, which is considered, contact between two people, can lead to an attitude change and being more open to a different opinion. Also, in terms of the equal status, friendly contact, they've done these studies, I pretty much also explain in your textbook that they've done these studies between blacks and Hispanics, and that has led to improvement in attitudes, not only with each other, but also with other outer groups. So even, in fact, indirect contact, sorry. I take that back. Friendly, this is more specifying the indirect contact, right? Indirect contact is also important. That friendly contact between black students and white students has led to improvement in attitudes with each other, but also this contact between these two groups has also led to a better view of other outgroups, both on behalf of blacks and whites. In terms of Hispanic is an example of another group that they tend to view favorably after positive contact with each other. And this also, they also did a study in terms of, I think, stories. Whenever they include outgroups as characters in the studies for children, they also measure then their open-mindedness and their willingness to be friendly and to become more interested in other ethnicities has also been shown in some research. On the flip side, contact has proven not to be enough in most cases. We know that in most desegregated schools, ethnic groups resegregate, as a label in psychology. Both groups also, they say that they're welcome contact with each other ethnicity. They say, well, no, not that I'm racist, not that I'm prejudiced, but apparently a common experience is that they perceive the other group, the other minority, or the other dominant group to not be interested in reciprocating the interest. So they just want to avoid feeling rebuffed or feeling rejected. So this, again, fits into the mirrored image perception, because apparently this happens on both sides. Black or Hispanic students in public schools say, well, we welcome the contact, it's just that I'm sure they're not interested, and vice versa. So because of this mirror image perception, you can see that there is no clarification of this perhaps misperception, and therefore the conflict continues there, going on and on. Second C, cooperation. So not only contact is enough, cooperation is necessary. And here, people introduce Muzaffar Sharif's study, Robert's Cave study, in fact. It's a very interesting one. It was done in the late 50s, early 60s, considered perhaps his most prominent work in social psychology. Again, this applies to discrimination and prejudice, too. They've tested this in schools, actually, the existence of superordinate goals. But before, let's talk about Muzaffar Sharif's Robert's Cave study. This study consisted of, what they did was, they had 22 Oklahoma kids in separate camp areas. So I believe there were 22 in each, or maybe 11 in each. Maybe it was that way. So 22 Oklahoma boys, all of them white, all of them middle class. They had a sort of a very objective standard of all of them being similar. So what they did was they had, let's say half of the 22, they had them on one side of the camp. They didn't know that other 11 were on the other side. I think a week later they introduced them. Oh, there's another group in this same camp. Once they met each other, Muzaffar Sharif's, what he did was he created conditions in which they were competing against each other. And what he found was that immediately, as I think he describes it as just as quick as fire begins to sort of gain strength, with that same speed, each group, once put in competition conditions, they began to express pretty much dangerous hostility against each other. There was a lot of name calling, but also there were fist fights began to erupt. And in fact, I think there was, I think they intended to burn perhaps a cabin, and they caught them as they plot this. It got pretty serious. I think there were some, today this would never go through in a committee, a reviewed board, an IRB. So anyway, so after these these acts of hostility were expressed, and they were violent against each other, expressing aggression against each other, Muzaffar Sharif introduced what superordinate goals to the group. And superordinate goals are, please pay attention, are shared goals that can only be achieved with cooperation and with the participation of everyone in the group. So he created these fake conditions. I think one of them was, well, we don't have running water left in the camp. And the only way we can get running water is if we push this truck that had all the water, something like that. And it required the help of all the boys, all the 22, both groups together, in order to achieve something that was of interest. Remember, the goal is of interest for everyone in the group, and therefore it requires the effort of everyone to move this truck. So that's the perfect fit for what a superordinate goal is. And according to Muzaffar Sharif, a superordinate goal is going to transform or mitigate these feelings of hostility in working all together towards a goal, not only just plain friendly contact, but working all of us together towards a goal that we are all interested in, right? All of them wanted running water. Then actually they ended up becoming friends. You can see pictures of this on the internet. You can see them, in fact, there are pictures of them engaging in hostile acts, and then you can see them all playing together and they forming friendships, etc. once the superordinate goals were introduced. The third C is communication, very simple. This usually is facilitated by mediation, and the mediator between conflict, once again, these are, from what my understanding is, that these are also in order of, these C's are in order of severe and complex the conflict might be. You know, perhaps it's solved by simple contact with each other, which is going to lead to mitigation of hostility feelings. or it might require then more working towards a particular goal with superordinate goals, or perhaps communication help is required. And when this is required, we need a mediator. A mediator's goal is to basically point each other points of view. Okay, you say what you say what you think, and then the goal here, the main goal though, is to, as a mediator, I must make both parties understand that each other here has their needs and has their goals. And that is the first step to negotiate. But again, I really need to, the mediator's job here is to make sure that these points come across. Again, each other states their point of view, and then each other also expresses their needs and goals, and the other person needs to sort of accept them, not in terms of accepting them also or saying that the other person is right, basically understanding where the other person is coming from. As you can see, this is leading towards feelings of empathy. So this all is related to each other. Then, as you might know, when we are in a conflict, we usually, communication is a tricky thing. Mediators need to be highly capable of making these points come across. And in that process, we're pretty much prone to intensifying the conflict. When we reach, wait a minute, there's a typo there, not dreadlock, of course not, deadlock. When when the conversation is deadlock, meaning I just don't understand you, you don't understand me, this could lead to tension begins to arise, or basically the situation can't move forward. And this is when there's a specific technique called graduated reciprocation intention reduction. So confusing, I know, but we need to know it. We need to practice it. And which was introduced, I forget by whom, referred to a method as restoring negotiations between two parties who are deadlocked. And basically, the essence of grit is to reestablish a negotiation by first reducing tension, by de-escalating, that's key there, de-escalating conflict, de-escalating tension, and then finally, by doing that first, then we, both parties or more, reach a safe space, and then that's when negotiations can begin. This was, I don't know the details, but it was used in the USSR and United States conflict, the Cold War. This person, who I forget the name, I think it's not important, sort of saw that the US and the USSR were escalating, in fact, in levels of tension by fortifying their nuclear power. And I think that I think de-escalation began by sort of seeing that we were putting the whole world at risk. And then this is how this technique sort of the basis for this for the application of grit to the Cold War situation. And the grit strategy basically consists of, very specifically, one person must first announce their intentions of reducing tension. They must say, well, I am willing to work this out. I announce my intention. And then also, they also have to, and then they say, okay, I am willing to compromise by doing this. And then finally, once they express their intention to reconcile, their intention to provide a concession is the term here I'm looking for. I'll do this, and this is going to benefit you, not necessarily me, right? It's unilateral. And then finally, this other party, the one who initiated this conciliation process, concession by providing this concession, then they also say, and I expect you to reciprocate for this. And then apparently this is how tensions begin to lower. I mean, conflict is very emotional. True that once we sort of cool off, then we can again go back to the drawing board or to the table to negotiate. This is basically what it all boils down for. I'm sure there are more specifics, but then again, grit is a very specific technique based on reducing tension. de-escalating the emotion behind it, de-escalating all these misperceptions, to try just step by step, trying to lower this heat of the conflict to a safer space in which negotiations could be seen with a more objective and a more in a less emotional way, and reach a common goal. Guys, this is all, finally, social psychology. Let's just throw it in the bag. Thank you.